Imagine building a philosophical system so perfect, like so mathematically airtight, that you literally declare all the problems of human philosophy officially solved.
Right, just completely done.
Yeah, you write the final sentence, you close the book, and you just quit academia. I mean, you give away your massive family fortune, and you go off to this rural village to become a gardener.
And a school teacher.
Right, a school teacher.
Yeah.
Because you genuinely believe you have finished the job that began with, Plato and Aristotle.
You've beaten philosophy.
Exactly. But then, a decade later, you look back at your own masterpiece, and you realize you made a fundamental error.
A massive error.
So you return, and you just completely tear down your own brilliant creation, like brick by brick, to build something entirely new and honestly far more radical.
It is, without a doubt, one of the most stunning arcs in intellectual history. I mean, we are talking about someone who didn't just revolutionize our understanding of language once, but did it twice.
Twice.
Yeah, and from two completely opposing directions.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring the mind of arguably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the core question we're going to explore with you today is this: do the words you use every single day act as little, physical name tags for objects out there in the real world?
Right, like labels.
Yeah, labels.
Mm-hmm.
Or are those words playing a hidden, incredibly complex game that actually constructs the reality you experience?
And to guide us through this, we're synthesizing two really phenomenal sources today.
Really dense ones, too.
Oh, very dense. We're drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's comprehensive entry on Wittgenstein, which gives us his life and foundational theories. And then to really get into the deep mechanics of his later thought, we're relying heavily on a brilliant master's thesis by George Risley.
Right, titled Wittgenstein's Conception of the Autonomy of Language and Its Implications for Natural Kinds. So before we can even begin to understand these hidden mechanics of language, we really need to understand the man who first tried to, put it all into a perfect crystalline box.
We have to talk about the man himself.
Yeah, who was Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Mm-hmm.
And how did he even end up trying to solve language in the first place?
Well, he was born in Vienna in 1889, and he was born into a family of almost unimaginable wealth.
Like serious money.
We are talking about the European industrial elite. His father was an iron and steel magnate, effectively the Andrew Carnegie of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, so Ludwig grew up in a literal palace where people like, Johannes Brahms and Gustav Klimt were just regular dinner guests.
That's casually hanging out.
Right, it was the absolute epicenter of high culture. But his own trajectory didn't start in philosophy or the arts at all. He was initially fascinated by the physical mechanics of the world. So in 1908, he went to Manchester University to study aeronautical engineering.
He was designing kites and trying to understand flight, right?
Exactly.
Which feels so physical, so grounded in aerodynamics and materials. How does a guy studying kites end up becoming the most abstract philosopher of his era?
It's a fascinating progression, really, because when you study aeronautics, you have to study propellers. And to design better propellers, you need advanced mathematics.
Okay, that makes sense.
So he dives into math. But Wittgenstein had a mind that couldn't just accept a tool without understanding how the tool itself was forged.
He had to go deeper.
Right. He started asking, what is math actually based on? What are the absolute undeniable foundations of numbers and equations?
Why does 1 + 1 actually equal 2?
Exactly. And that relentless questioning pushed him away from engineering, away from pure math, and straight into the philosophy of mathematics. And at that time, the undisputed king of that field was Bertrand Russell at Cambridge.
The Stanford entry has this incredible detail about him just showing up unannounced at Cambridge in 1911 to study with Russell.
Just knocks on his door.
Yeah. And Russell's diary entries about him are hilarious. He describes this unknown German appearing at his door, calling him, I think the quote is, obstinate and perverse, but I think not stupid.
Which is high praise from Bertrand Russell.
Right. But within a remarkably short period, Russell's view totally shifts.
It shifts dramatically because, Russell was exhausted. He had spent years trying to formulate the absolute logical foundations of mathematics in his own massive work, the Principia Mathematica.
It sounds intense.
It was. He felt he was getting too old, that his mind was losing its sharpest edge. And then this intense, brooding young man arrives. And within a year, Russell realizes he is in the presence of just raw, unfiltered genius.
Wow.
He actually declares that Wittgenstein is the only person capable capable of solving the philosophical problems that he himself could no longer crack.
But Wittgenstein wasn't exactly your typical Cambridge academic, right? Like, he didn't want to sit in the faculty lounge and debate over sherry. The sources describe him as needing a level of isolation that borders on the extreme.
Oh, absolutely. He found the academic environment, the socializing, the polite conversations to be totally stifling. He believed that to truly see the logical bones of the universe, you couldn't have the flesh of human interaction getting in the way.
He needed pure, undistracted mental space.
Right. So he would literally leave England and retreat to a remote cabin he built on a fjord in Norway.
Just alone in Norway.
Entirely alone. He would stay there for months at a time, just intensely pondering the foundations of logic.
And then, of course, the world entirely collapses. World War I breaks out. And given his background, I mean, you might think a wealthy heir would find a safe desk job somewhere.
You'd think so.
But he joins the Austrian army. And he doesn't just join. He requests to be sent to the front lines.
Yeah, he wants to be in the thick of it.
He is literally surviving artillery fire in the trenches, eventually getting captured and put in an Italian prisoner of war camp in 1918.
And it's in that environment, surrounded by the absolute worst chaos, death, and noise of human history, that he formulates a philosophy of perfect, silent, unyielding order.
It's wild to think about.
He carried notebooks in his rucksack throughout the war, writing down logical propositions under mortar fire. And those notes became his first masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
That context completely changes how you read it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's not just an academic text. It's an attempt to find an anchor of absolute truth in a world that is literally exploding around him.
Beautifully put.
But from what I understand, reading the Tractatus is a uniquely punishing experience. Like, it doesn't read like a normal book with chapters and paragraphs.
Oh, no, it doesn't read like narrative prose at all. It is built entirely around 7 core propositions, and it uses this strict decimal numbering system.
Like an outline.
Kind of. So you have proposition 1, and then under that, an elaboration numbered 1.1, and under that, 1.11, and so on.
I do that. I mean, why not just write an essay like a normal philosopher?
Because for the early Wittgenstein, logic isn't a story you tell, it's a structure you inhabit. The decimal system visually demonstrates the architecture of his thought. Every subpoint is logically nested inside the point above it.
So the form of the book mimics the theory itself.
Exactly. It's meant to show that reality itself is a mathematical hierarchy. And it begins with proposition 1, which is a massive metaphysical stake in the ground. He writes, "The world is all that is the case."
Okay.
And he immediately follows that up by stating that the world is a totality of facts, not of objects.
See, that is exactly where I get tripped up. I'm sitting here looking around my room. I see a microphone. I see a coffee cup. I see a desk. To my mind, my reality is very clearly made up of physical objects. What does he mean when he says the world is made of facts?
Let's test that. Imagine I give you an incredibly detailed inventory list of every single object in your room.
Okay.
I list a microphone, a cup, a desk, a wire. Does that list tell me what your room actually looks like?
No, I guess it just tells you what's in the box, so to speak. Like, you wouldn't know if the cup is on the desk or if the desk is upside down on the ceiling.
Precisely. Just having a mental dictionary of objects tells you absolutely nothing about the state of the universe. Reality isn't a pile of disconnected things. Reality is how those things are configured.
Oh, I see.
The cup is on the desk is a configuration. It describes a specific state of affairs. That is a fact. So if you want to perfectly describe the world, you can't just list nouns. You have to state all the facts, every single configuration of objects that currently exists.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. The objects are just the raw materials, but the facts are the actual architecture of reality.
Exactly.
And this concept is the foundation for what the Stanford entry identifies as his massive breakthrough, which is the picture theory of language. So how does Wittgenstein connect this world of facts to the sentences coming out of our mouths?
Well, he argues that there is a strict mathematical isomorphism between language and reality.
Isomorphism.
It just means a preservation of structure. According to the Tractatus, a meaningful sentence is literally a logical picture of a fact.
I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Is it like an ultra-high definition photograph? Like, if I take a picture of my desk, every physical photon bouncing off the coffee cup corresponds to a specific pixel in the digital image. Is he saying our sentences do that same kind of mapping?
That is a very, very helpful way to visualize it. In his view, when you construct a sentence that has actual meaning, The logical structure of your sentence maps directly onto the logical structure of the fact out there in the world.
Like a one-to-one ratio.
Right. The words act as elements representing the objects, and the grammatical arrangement of your words mirrors the physical arrangement of the objects in reality. The structure of language and the structure of reality share the exact same logical form.
So language is basically a mirror reflecting the configurations of the universe. But what happens if I say something that doesn't map onto a physical fact? What if I try to take a picture, but there are no objects reflecting photons for the camera to capture?
Then the early Wittgenstein would say you have produced literal nonsense.
Nonsense.
And it's crucial to understand that he isn't using nonsense as an insult here.
Right, it's not like he's just calling you stupid.
Exactly. He is using it as a strict technical categorization. He divided all human language into what has sense and what is nonsense.
So what makes the cut? What actually has sense?
Only the propositions of the natural sciences.
That's it.
That's it. A sentence like, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, or the coffee cup is on the desk. Those have sense because they picture a factual, empirical state of affairs that we can verify as true or false. They map onto the world.
But if that's true, I mean, it excludes almost everything we actually care about. If a sentence has to picture a physical fact to be meaningful, what happens to ethics? What happens to art? Like, if I say murder is morally wrong, I can't point to a physical object called wrongness in the world.
No, you can't.
I get like a logical photograph of a moral value.
You've hit the exact boundary he was trying to draw. Under the strict rules of the Tractatus, traditional metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, theology, all of it is categorized as nonsense. You cannot speak about them meaningfully because they don't picture physical facts.
But from reading his biography, he wasn't some cold, unfeeling robot. He was a deeply ethical, almost tormented, mystical person.
Yeah.
If he cared so much about morality and meaning, why did he build a philosophical system that calls those very things nonsense?
It's the central paradox of his early work, and it's profound. He didn't call them nonsense because he thought they were unimportant. He believed they were actually the most important aspects of human existence.
Wait, really?
Yeah, but he believed that the most vital things, morality, beauty, the ultimate meaning of life, cannot be captured by the crude machinery of language. They lie outside the boundaries of what words can do.
Oh, wow.
As he framed it, these things cannot be said, they can only be shown.
Oh, so they manifest in how we live, not in the theories we write about them.
Exactly. The moment you try to build a philosophical theory to explain the good or the beautiful, you are misusing the tool of language. You're trying to force language to do something it structurally cannot do.
Like trying to take a picture of the wind.
Yes. Which leads to Proposition 7, the final haunting line of the book. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
He's telling us to stop trying to philosophize about the soul and just let it exist.
Precisely.
But there is a glaring contradiction here that I just can't ignore. If all philosophical propositions that don't describe physical facts are nonsense, what of the Tractatus itself? Because the book isn't a list of scientific facts, it's a book of philosophy.
Yeah.
Did you think his own book was nonsense?
Yes, he explicitly acknowledged it.
You're kidding?
No, and to explain it, he uses one of the most famous metaphors in philosophy. The ladder. He essentially tells the reader, my entire book is a ladder. You must climb up these propositions to see the world rightly. But once you reach the top, once you understand the limits of language, you must recognize that the rungs you stepped on were nonsense.
So you have to kick the ladder away.
Kick the ladder away.
That is just staggering. He spends years in the trenches, writes a dense revolutionary book, climbs to the top of his own logic, tells everyone, by the way, everything I just said was nonsense designed to cure you of wanting to do philosophy. Kicks the ladder away and walks off to Austria to teach elementary school.
He genuinely believed he had solved the entire history of philosophy by proving that philosophical problems were just language errors. He gave away his immense inheritance to his siblings, kept nothing for himself, and lived a life of severe, almost monastic austerity. He thought he was done.
But he wasn't done. And this brings us to the second act of his life, which completely upends everything we just talked about.
Right, because he spends about a decade away from academia. But slowly, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he starts having conversations with thinkers from the Vienna Circle, which was a group of philosophers heavily influenced by his early work.
Okay.
And through these conversations, a creeping realization sets in. He begins to see that his Ultra HD photograph theory, his perfect logical matrix, has a fatal flaw.
What was the flaw? Did he realize the camera was broken?
He realized the camera never existed in the first place.
Oh, why?
He returns to Cambridge in 1929, and he begins ruthlessly dismantling his early dogmatism. He realizes he had been seduced by a myth. He had been obsessed with finding this hidden, pure, crystalline essence underneath language, a hidden logical structure that tied words perfectly to the world.
But there is no hidden essence.
No. As he looked closer at how human beings actually communicate, he realized there is no hidden crystalline essence.
The Stanford entry details how this shift culminates in his posthumous masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations. And it's a total paradigm shift. If language isn't a logical picture of facts, what is it?
He introduces a radically new definition. The meaning of a word is not the object it stands for. The meaning of a word is its use in the language.
Meaning is use.
Exactly.
That sounds simple, but it feels like it fundamentally changes the ground rules. Can we walk through an example of what that looks like in practice?
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to let go of the idea that words are just pointing at things.
It is hard. To explain this, Wittgenstein introduces a concept he calls language games. Let's look at one of his most famous examples, the builder's game.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine a primitive language shared by two people, a builder and an assistant. They are constructing a building, and their entire language consists of only 4 words: block, pillar, slab, and beam.
Okay, 4 words, very simple.
The builder yells out, "Slab!" Now, under the old theory of the Tractatus, what is the word slab doing? It's a noun. It's a label pointing to a physical object, a picture of a fact.
Right, the physical slab of stone.
But the later Wittgenstein says, stop looking at the word in isolation and look at the action taking place. When the builder yells slab, he isn't just naming a piece of stone. He is issuing a command.
He's telling the assistant to go fetch the slab and bring it to him.
Exactly. The meaning of the utterance slab isn't found by staring at the rock. It's found in the complex human activity that the word triggers. It's an instruction. It's interwoven with the behavior of fetching, carrying, and building.
Okay, so language is not a passive mirror reflecting reality. It is an active instrument we use to navigate reality. It is a form of social action.
You nailed it.
Okay, let's unpack this. I see where this is going. The early Wittgenstein treated every single word as if it were exactly the same kind of tool like a ruler. He thought the only job of language was to measure reality, to state facts.
Yeah.
But the later Wittgenstein is essentially saying, open the toolbox.
The toolbox analogy is perfect.
Right. When you open a toolbox, you don't just see rulers. You see a hammer, a screwdriver, a saw, maybe some glue. You wouldn't pick up a hammer and ask, how does this measure a piece of wood?
Right, because that's a misunderstanding of what a hammer is for.
A hammer is for driving nails. A saw is for cutting. Glue is for binding. The later Wittgenstein is saying, our words are like those diverse tools. We use some words to state facts, sure. But we use other words to give orders, to tell jokes, to pray, to curse, to make up stories, to guess riddles.
And trying to force all those wildly different tools into one single category, saying they all must picture facts or be deemed nonsense, is a philosophical trap. Because tools have such wildly different uses, trying to find one single essence of language is just a fool's errand.
This directly attacks how philosophers have operated since Socrates. We've always been taught to look for the essence of a thing. Like, what is the true essence of justice? What is the true essence of truth?
Yes, and Wittgenstein thinks this craving for essences is what makes philosophy so confused. To cure us of this craving, he asks us to look at a very common word, a concept we use all the time, and try to find its essence. He chooses the word game. Try to define it. What is the one essential hidden feature that all games share which makes them games?
Let's see. You have board games like chess. You have card games like poker. You have Olympic games like the marathon. You have children's games like tag. If I try to find a common thread, well, chess and poker have winners and losers. But then you have a game like throwing a ball against a wall by yourself. And there's no opponent, no winner.
So competition isn't the essence.
Right. And board games use pieces and boards, but tag is just physical running. The Olympics require immense physical skill, but a game of roulette is purely luck. There really is no single common denominator that runs through every single thing we call a game.
Wittgenstein argues there is absolutely no essential core. Instead, what you find when you look closely is a complicated network of similarities that overlap and crisscross. He calls this family resemblance.
Family resemblance.
Yeah, think of a large family portrait. You look at the grandparents, the parents, the cousins. The son might have his mother's eyes. The mother has the grandfather's nose. The cousin has the uncle's jawline. There is no one single physical feature that every single person in that photo shares. Yet, They undeniably resemble one another. They form a family.
And he's saying concepts in our language work the same way. The word game doesn't have a rigid boundary based on one strict definition. It's a web of overlapping uses.
Yes. Language isn't a rigid geometric grid. It's an organic, sprawling, lived practice.
Okay, I am tracking with this shift from strict pictures to organic tools, but this creates a massive new problem in my mind.
Uh-oh, what's that?
If meaning is determined by how a word is used, and there are no fixed essences, doesn't language become entirely subjective and, totally chaotic? Like, if I'm walking down the street with a friend and I point to a helicopter in the sky and say, look at that beautiful dog, can I just claim that in my own personal use, the word dog means helicopter? Am I allowed to invent my own private meanings willy-nilly?
That is one of the most vital challenges to his theory, and it brings us to a major section of the investigations known as the private language argument. His answer is a definitive no.
Phew.
You cannot just make up meanings willy-nilly. And the reason goes back to the concept of the game. A game, by definition, requires rules.
Right. If I sit down to play chess with you, I can't just decide my pawn can jump across the board and take your king on the first move. You would say, I'm not playing chess anymore.
Exactly. For a rule to be a rule, there must be a way to distinguish between following the rule correctly and thinking you are following it but actually making a mistake. In a public game of chess, the rules are external to you. If you move the pawn illegally, I can point to the rule book or the community consensus and correct you. There is a public standard of correctness.
So how does that apply to my dog and helicopter example?
If you try to invent a purely private language, a language where only you know the rules, where the meanings are entirely locked inside your own mind, you have no standard of correctness. If you call a helicopter a dog today, and tomorrow you call a bicycle a dog, there is no external check on your behavior.
I can't be wrong.
And if you can't be wrong, which means you can't be right either, the whole concept of meaning collapses. Language requires a community. It requires public agreement.
It's not just a solo activity.
Yeah.
To speak a language is to participate in what he calls a shared form of life. We have to agree on the rules of the game to play it together.
Yes. And understanding those rules, understanding what moves are allowed in the language game and what moves aren't, leads us directly into George Risley's thesis and into Wittgenstein's highly unique, almost bizarre use of the word grammar.
Let's unpack that, because when I hear the word grammar, my brain immediately goes back to high school English class. I think about subject-verb agreement, where to put a comma, making sure I don't dangle a participle. But Risley makes it very clear that Wittgenstein is doing something much, much deeper with that word.
We have to completely discard the high school definition. For Wittgenstein, grammar is not about syntax. It is not about sentence structure. Grammar refers to the deep underlying rules that determine what makes sense to say in the first place. Grammar draws the conceptual boundaries of our world.
The thesis uses a specific example to illustrate this that I found really helpful. It looks at the statement, a sofa is longer than a chair.
A classic example.
Now, on its surface, that sounds like an empirical observation. It sounds like a scientific fact you can prove by going to a furniture store with a tape measure. But Risley points out that for Wittgenstein, this statement is actually a grammatical rule.
Think about what happens if you find a very long chair and a very short sofa. Do you call the scientific journals and say you've discovered an anomaly in the fabric of the universe?
Right. No, you don't.
If a child points to a love seat and asks, is that a large chair? You might correct them and say, no, a sofa is longer than a chair. You aren't teaching them a fact about the world. You are teaching them how to use the word sofa.
I'm defining the boundaries of the concept for them. I'm telling them the rules of the furniture language game.
Exactly. Grammar tells us what kind of object anything is. It dictates what moves are valid. For instance, the rules of our grammar make it perfectly sensible to say, I feel pain in my arm.
Right.
But those same rules make it conceptually meaningless to say, I see the pain in my arm, unless you are speaking in deliberate poetic metaphor. It's not physically impossible. It's grammatically excluded. It violates the rules of the game.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This concept completely blew my mind when Risley applied it to mathematics. Because Wittgenstein takes this idea of grammar and points it directly at numbers. He argues that a statement like 2 + 2 = 4 is not an empirical fact that we discover out in the wild. It is a grammatical rule. It's a standard of correctness.
It is a highly provocative stance, especially for people who view mathematics as the ultimate objective truth of the universe. But let's look at how we actually use the equation 2 plus 2, 4. If you have 2 apples and someone hands you 2 more apples and you count them and somehow get 5, what is your reaction?
I assume I made a mistake counting.
I don't.
Assume the laws of physics have broken down and matter has spontaneously generated.
Right. You don't doubt the equation, you doubt your own counting. The equation 2 plus 2 plus 4 is the norm. It is the ruler against which we judge our empirical reality. It determines what counts as a correct calculation. It is an unshakable rule of the math language game.
Wait, let me pause here, because I think a lot of listeners have the exact same reaction I did. Even if 2 plus 2, 4 functions as a rule right now, didn't it originally come from empirical observation? Thousands of years ago, didn't early humans put 2 rocks next to 2 rocks, count 4, and realize, hey, this is a fact about how the world works? Didn't reality dictate the rule?
Risley addresses this directly in the thesis. Wittgenstein concedes that many of these propositions likely began as empirical observations. We observed how objects behaved. But over time, through centuries of human practice, that observation was hardened into a rule.
Hardened into a rule.
Yeah, it was removed from the traffic of daily testing. It went from being a hypothesis we check against the world to the very instrument we use to measure the world.
The thesis uses the phrase, shunted onto an unused siding, like a train car that is no longer part of the active traffic, but just sits there as a permanent fixture. It graduates from being a theory to being the ruler itself.
Precisely. And this graduation from object to ruler is perfectly illustrated by one of Wittgenstein's most famous and confounding thought experiments, the standard meter in Paris.
Oh, this is such a great example. Before lasers and atomic clocks, the global definition of a meter was tied to a physical object. A platinum iridium bar kept in a heavily guarded vault in Paris.
It was the absolute standard for measurement. But Wittgenstein asks us to consider how we talk about that specific metal bar, and he drops this profound logical puzzle. He states that you can neither say the standard meter is a meter long, nor can you say it is not a meter long.
Which sounds completely absurd at first. Of course, the meter bar is a meter long. It's the meter.
But think about what it means to say X is a meter long. To make that statement, you have to measure object X against the accepted standard of a meter. You have to compare it to the rule. But the bar in Paris is the rule. You cannot measure the ruler against itself. It doesn't make sense to say the ruler is as long as the ruler. The bar doesn't have a length in meters. It defines what a length in meters is.
Oh, wow. So attributing a length to the standard meter is a grammatical confusion. We are confusing the tool with the object being measured.
Yes. It plays a unique foundational role in our language game. And this brings us to another concept closely tied to this, ostensive definitions.
Right, Risley spends time on this. An ostensive definition is when you try to define a word simply by pointing at something.
Yeah.
You point to a swatch of paint and say, that is red. You point out the window and say, that is north. It seems like the most direct way to connect language to reality. But Wittgenstein argues that pointing is actually a massive trap.
It's a trap because pointing only works if the person you are communicating with already understands the underlying grammar. If I point to the north and say, that is north, what are you actually looking at?
I might think you're pointing at a specific tree on the horizon. Or a cloud. Or maybe you're pointing at the concept of distance itself.
Exactly. For my pointing to mean cardinal direction, you already have to be playing the language game of cardinal directions. If I hold up a small wooden carving and say, this is the queen, you won't understand what I mean unless you already understand the complex grammar of a board game, the concept of a piece, the idea that pieces have rules for movement.
Because the pointing doesn't magically download the concept into your brain.
Right. It just places a new physical token onto a grammatical board you already know how to play on.
The grammar has to be there first. The rules of the game have to precede the naming of the objects. But this leads us to what I think is the most radical and potentially uncomfortable part of Risley's thesis and Wittgenstein's later philosophy. If grammar tells us what makes sense, and these grammatical rules, whether it's the definition of a sofa, the laws of addition, or the primary colors, are just conventions that hardened over time, what grounds them? When we dig all the way down to the bottom of our language, what anchors the anchor?
Wittgenstein's answer is uncompromising. Nothing. Nothing anchors it at all. This is the doctrine of the autonomy of language. Grammar is entirely arbitrary.
Arbitrary. That is a word that makes people squirm. Because it implies there is no ultimate objective truth holding our reality together.
Hmm.
Risley lays out 5 specific ways that grammar is arbitrary, and I want us to really take our time walking through them because they dismantle a lot of our basic assumptions about the world.
Let's take them one by one. Point 1. Grammar determines meaning. It is not read off the world. We've touched on this with the standard meter. The universe doesn't have a built-in label for meter or sofa or red. We don't discover these meanings floating in reality. We bring the meaning to reality through our grammatical rules.
Okay, point 2. Grammar is unverifiable. Now, someone might push back and say, I can verify my grammar, I can prove my language is correct, because look, grass is green, the sky is blue, and water is wet. Reality proves my language right. Why does Wittgenstein reject that?
Because the argument is entirely circular. To describe reality, to prove that your language matches the world, you have to use your language. If you argue, my grammar is correct because glass is green, you are already relying on the grammatical concepts of green and grass to make your proof. You haven't stepped outside of language to check it against an objective reality. You are just running laps inside your own track. You can't use a ruler to prove that the ruler is accurate.
Which brings us to point 3, which is probably the most controversial. Grammar is neither right nor wrong. He argues that our specific human grammar, the way we categorize the world, isn't more correct than another culture's entirely different grammar.
And we are going to need a very strong thought experiment to unpack that one because it fights against all our instincts. But before we do, let's finish the list. Point 4. Grammar is not justified by its effects.
Meaning, even if our language allows us to build suspension bridges, invent vaccines, and fly to the moon, that doesn't prove our grammar is metaphysically true. It just proves our grammar is incredibly useful.
Yes. A hammer is useful for building a house, but we don't say the hammer is metaphysically true. And finally, point 5. Grammar is not determined by goals. We didn't invent language with a preconceived, conscious blueprint of what we wanted to achieve. Because to have a blueprint, to have a goal, you already need a language to formulate it. Language evolved organically. It wasn't engineered to solve a specific problem.
Okay, let's go back to point 3, that grammar is neither right nor wrong. Because Risley explores this using a fascinating hypothetical scenario called Tribe X. Imagine an explorer goes deep into an unexplored jungle and makes contact with a previously isolated group of people, Tribe X. As he studies their language, he realizes they categorize the visual world in a way that is fundamentally alien to us. They do not separate color and shape.
Try to conceptualize that. In English, we have a concept for red and a concept for circle. We can apply the color red to a circle, a square, a car, or an apple. But Tribe X's grammar doesn't allow for that abstraction. They have one single indivisible word for red circle. And they have a completely different, unrelated word for blue circle and a third word for red square.
To them, a red circle and a blue circle are not variations of the same shape. They are completely different kinds of entities. They look at them and do not see a shared property called circularity. That abstraction simply does not exist in the rules of their language game. Now, my immediate reaction, I think the reaction of almost anyone listening, is to say, well, Tribe X is just wrong. They are factually, objectively incorrect. Look at the physical world. A red circle and a blue circle are clearly the exact same shape. They are ignoring the obvious reality of geometry. But Wittgenstein says, we cannot say they are wrong.
He forces us to realize how deeply trapped we are inside our own grammar. We believe our grammatical habit of separating color and shape is a perfect mirror of the universe. But think about how you would try to prove Tribe X wrong. You would put a red circle and a blue circle on a table, point at them and say, see, they share a shape.
Right.
But remember the problem with pointing. Any pointing you do, any comparing you do, relies entirely on our grammatical rules of comparison. You are using our game to judge their game. Their grammar combines what ours divides. The universe itself doesn't care.
I found myself trying to formulate an analogy for this, and I kept coming back to units of measurement. Let's say I measure a piece of wood and say it's 100 centimeters long. You measure it and say it's 39.3 inches long. I can't look at you and say you are metaphysically wrong about the universe. The universe doesn't have a preference for the metric system over the imperial system. They're just different arbitrary tools for carving up space. Wittgenstein is suggesting that Tribe X is just using a different unit of conceptual measurement.
That analogy holds up beautifully. And Risley's thesis doesn't just rely on hypothetical tribes. He brings in real-world linguistic anthropology, specifically the work of Benjamin Lee Whorf regarding the Hopi Native Americans. Whorf argued And while the strict interpretation of his work is debated, the philosophical point stands that the Hopi language doesn't possess our concept of time as a smooth, flowing continuum moving uniformly from past to present to future.
We visualize time like a river or a timeline on a whiteboard. Worf suggested their grammar handles events and durations completely differently, focusing on whether an event is manifesting or has manifested, rather than placing it on a linear track.
And if that is the case, Wittgenstein's philosophy applies perfectly. The Hopi grammar isn't incorrect, and the European grammar isn't correct. They aren't competing scientific theories about the physics of time. They are different forms of life. They carve up the chaotic phenomena of existence using different tools.
I hear what you're saying, but I have to push back here. Because there's a very powerful counterargument to this idea that everything is just arbitrary grammar. What about modern science? Let's go back to the color example. Our ancestors invented the words red and blue, arbitrarily, sure. But then, centuries later, scientists discovered electromagnetic frequencies. We discovered that red light actually corresponds to a specific, measurable wavelength of radiation, and blue light corresponds to a different wavelength. Doesn't that scientific discovery prove that our grammar is correct? Doesn't the physics of light prove that colors are distinct, objective realities, and therefore Tribex is objectively wrong?
You have just articulated the central tension in modern philosophy of language. Does science discover the ultimate objective meaning of our words? This pushback leads us perfectly into the final, heaviest philosophical clash in the material. Because George Risley pits Wittgenstein against one of the most important analytic philosophers of the late 20th century, a man who champions the exact scientific view you just laid out.
Ooh, a showdown. Who is the challenger?
Saul Kripke. Kripke developed a highly influential theory regarding what philosophers call natural kinds. Natural kinds are categories of things that exist in nature independently of human thought. Things like gold, water, tigers, or lightning. Kripke argues that the terms we use for these natural kinds act like proper names. He calls them rigid designators.
Meaning they point to the exact same essence in every possible universe, regardless of what we happen to know about them at the time.
Precisely. For Kripke, the role of science is to dig into reality and discover the true, hidden essence of these natural kinds. Take the word gold. For centuries, people defined gold by its surface properties. It's yellow, it's shiny, it's heavy, it doesn't tarnish. But then modern chemistry comes along and discovers that the true essence of gold is its atomic structure. Gold is the element with the atomic number 79.
And once we discover that, the definition is locked in permanently.
Yes. According to Kripke, it becomes a metaphysical necessity that gold is the substance with atomic number 79. He draws a sharp line between epistemological necessity, things we can know prior to experiencing the world, like math, and metaphysical necessity, things that are objectively true in all possible worlds. Even if we traveled to another planet and found a yellow, shiny, heavy metal that looked and acted exactly like gold, if we tested it and found it was not atomic number 79, Kripke says it would emphatically not be gold.
Because 79 is the hidden essence. It's the scientific truth that grounds the word. Kripke is saying science finds the true meaning that was sitting there in the dirt all along, waiting for us to discover it.
That is Kripke's view. But Wittgenstein, as interpreted through Risley's thesis, completely rejects this. He mounts a massive counterstrike against the idea that science determines meaning. For Wittgenstein, meaning is not discovered by science. Meaning is antecedent to scientific investigation. Meaning must come first.
How does that work? If science discovers the wavelength of red light, doesn't that explain what red is?
Think about the timeline, the grammar of our color words, the rules for how we use the words red, blue, and green, was invented, established, and successfully played as a language game for thousands of years before anyone even conceived of radiation or a spectrometer. We had to define the concept of color, we had to agree on the rules for what we were pointing at before we could ever point a scientific instrument at it to measure its frequency.
Oh, I see. We built the box, and then science measured what was inside it.
Yeah.
If Tribe X doesn't separate color and shape, if they only have a word for red circle, discovering electromagnetic waves wouldn't mean the same thing to them. They wouldn't look at a readout of a wavelength and say, this isolates the color part of our red circle. They would process that scientific data through their own grammar.
Exactly. The physical waves do not justify the grammar. The grammar dictates how we categorize the waves. Risley phrases it beautifully in the thesis. He says that to claim, because there are 4 primary colors, grammar must speak of 4 primary colors, is to suffer from a profound conceptual confusion. You have the cart before the horse. It is because of our grammar that we can say there are four primary colors.
Science operates entirely within the boundaries set by grammar. Scientists aren't discovering new meanings for our everyday words. They were discovering new empirical facts about the objects our words currently pick out, based on the arbitrary rules we already agreed upon.
Let's apply that back to Kripke's gold example. If we, as a linguistic community, decide to change the rules of the game, if we decide to redefine gold to mean any shiny yellow metal, regardless of atomic structure, then suddenly, fool's gold becomes gold. The physical atomic structure of the universe didn't change one bit. What changed were the rules of our game.
So what does this all mean? Trying to synthesize these two opposing views. I keep thinking about architects and archaeologists. Kripke views us as linguistic archaeologists. He thinks the true meaning of words like gold, water, and color are buried in the dirt of the universe, and we are slowly digging them up with the tools of science. But Wittgenstein thinks we are architects. We didn't dig up the meanings. We drew the blueprints for what gold means. We built the house of language, we decided where the walls and doors go, and then we let the scientists walk in to furnish the room.
That captures the divide perfectly. Kripke believes the structure of meaning is out there in the mind-independent world. Wittgenstein believes the structure of meaning is entirely located in the grammar we've arbitrarily evolved and adopted as a human community.
But if we follow Wittgenstein all the way down this path, if science doesn't justify our language, and our language is just an arbitrary game with no ultimate metaphysical grounding, does Wittgenstein think his own profession is basically useless? If philosophy can't find the true essence of reality, what are philosophers supposed to do all day?
It leads to the most poignant and perhaps humbling conclusion of his later work. He redefines the entire purpose of philosophy. For the later Wittgenstein, philosophy is no longer about building grand theories of the universe. It is not about constructing abstract metaphysical castles to explain truth and reality. Philosophy is therapy.
Therapy? In what sense?
Linguistic therapy. He came to believe that almost all the massive, intractable problems of philosophy debates about the nature of consciousness, the existence of free will, the essence of truth, are not profound mysteries of the universe. They are conceptual confusions. They are caused by language going on holiday. We take a word from its everyday use, we pull it out of its proper language game, we stare at it in isolation, and we get tangled up in our own arbitrary rules.
We confuse the tool for the reality it measures.
Exactly. And the goal of the philosopher is not to solve a mystery, but to untangle the knot. As he famously wrote in the Investigations, the aim of philosophy is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle.
We are the fly.
We are the fly, buzzing around frantically, trapped in the transparent illusions created by our own words. We hit the glass over and over, trying to find the ultimate essence of justice or reality. Philosophy's only job is to gently show us the exit, to reveal that the boundaries trapping us are just grammatical conventions, so we can stop buzzing, fly out into the open air, and just live.
To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. What a devastatingly beautiful way to view the search for knowledge.
It really is.
Let's take a step back and look at the incredible arc we've covered today. We started with a solitary, intense genius, shivering in the muddy trenches of World War I, furiously writing down logical propositions. He was trying to build a perfect, crystalline, mathematical picture of reality, an infallible, ultra HD mapping of the universe. He thought he had built a ladder to absolute truth.
And then he kicked it away.
Right. And then decades later, we end up in this fluid, messy, socially constructed matrix. We discover that language is a toolbox filled with incredibly diverse instruments. We learn that grammar is just the arbitrary rules of a game we all unconsciously agree to play. We realize that science itself, the ultimate engine of objective truth, operates strictly inside the boundaries of the words we invent.
It is a staggering intellectual journey.
Yeah.
He forces us to move from seeking absolute logical precision to embracing the messy, arbitrary, but deeply beautiful reality of human practice and shared forms of life.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought based on all of this. Sometime this week, you're going to find yourself in a heated, seemingly unresolvable debate. Maybe it's a silly internet argument over whether a hot dog is technically a sandwich. Or maybe it's a profound, intense debate over whether a certain new generative AI is truly conscious. When you find yourself hitting a wall in that argument, take a step back. Remember Wittgenstein's fly bottle. Realize that you probably aren't debating the physical facts of reality. The physical ingredients of the hot dog are known. The code of the AI is known. What you are actually doing is negotiating grammar. You are arguing over the rules of a game. You are trying to decide where to draw the arbitrary boundary of a concept.
You're just playing a language game.
Exactly. And if language is truly autonomous, if our deepest categories are just tools in a box that we fashion for our own use, you have to ask yourself a slightly terrifying question. What other absolute truths in your life, the things you believe are fundamental laws of the universe, are actually just arbitrary units of measurement you've blindly accepted from the culture around you? It's something to mull over, to see if you can spot the glass of the fly bottle until our next deep dive.